Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn, and where do we start this week? There is so much news coming out almost on a daily basis. News about Mexican cartels, news about immigration, news about fentanyl, the terrorist designation, discussions between Trump and Sheinbaum. I mean, there's just so much information. We're going to try and distill some of it for you today. The theme of today, at least the main subject matter, is I want to talk about the state of CDS, particularly in light of the losses that Los Chapitos have suffered over the last few months, and talk a little bit more about what that really means. Before we do that, though, I want to hit the highlights on some news stories from the last few days. Two things to keep in mind. Number one, I'm trying to distill this down into short clips, so I can't provide, everything. So there may be more information out there that would be helpful. There may be more information that's a little bit different than what I'm going to say. The second point is things change pretty rapidly, and stories have come out over the last couple of weeks that prove to be false or not exactly as portrayed, or they're different than we thought. So keep that in mind as well. So last Friday's news is that El Mayo demanded his repatriation from the United States. And said that if he wasn't so repatriated, the relationship between the United States and Mexico will suffer a, quote, collapse. And I note that the collapse had an exclamation point after it. So it really will collapse. El Mayo's legal advisor in Mexico, Juan Manuel Delgado Gonzalez, confirmed that a petition was presented at the Mexican Consulate General in New York, and where El Mayo demanded that the Mexican government defend him. Essentially, he says a couple of things. Number one, he's concerned about getting the death penalty in the United States. He says that's against Mexican law and Mexican interests. Therefore, he should be repatriated. Number two, he notes that he was, taken into the United States illegally under Mexican law, and that if his rights aren't protected by Mexico, it sets things up for Mexican politicians and officials to be kidnapped and illegally transferred into the United States. Though, frankly, that right is there, has been since, the Machain case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. A number of people looking at the letter from, or the repatriation request demand from El Mayo have raised a couple of questions. So, number one, we've been hearing all these stories of how El Mayo is cooperating. Remember a few weeks ago, he's giving a veritable encyclopedia of the politicians who are or have been corrupt in their relationship with the cartels. This repatriation demand doesn't sound like he's really cooperating like that. Number two, it's a little Don Quixote-like in the sense that, does anyone really see a set of scenarios under which the U.S. would return El Mayo to Mexico? And then the last thing is, whether intended or not, it puts President Sheinbaum and the Mexican government kind of back into a corner, right? I mean, what are they supposed to do in response to this? They likely aren't going to be able to have him repatriated. So is there any point in making that effort? but do they also want to defend the sovereignty of Mexico and not have others kidnapped like that? So there's that. And we'll see where that goes. As I said, I think the news on this came out on Friday, so lots more should be coming this week. Item number 2, the State Department finally announced the designation of those cartels/gangs that they wanted to designate as terrorist organizations. And listen to this list. So you have Tren de Aragua, MS-13, the Sinaloa Cartel, CJNG, Cartel del Noreste, La Nueva Familia Michoacana, the Gulf Cartel, and Cartels Unidos. Those all were designated as foreign terrorist organizations and also as specially designated global terrorists. Now, what's interesting about these, in my mind, is a couple of things. Number one, notice that it was MS-13 and Tren de Aragua that were the ones listed first. I find that kind of interesting, and wonder if there was any hidden meaning to that. Also notice who's not listed. The Juarez Cartel is not listed. La Linea is not listed. So query, just at this point, what was the thought process on which ones were listed and which ones weren't, and how is that going to play out as things go forward? So we'll be looking for that going forward as well. Something that we're going to talk about in a week or so is a supposed truce amongst the Gulf Cartel, a truce that at least apparently settles some land disputes and also may include a agreement between the parties to stop trafficking in fentanyl. And though we've heard stories in the past, most significantly from Los Chapitos of, demanding that fentanyl stop being manufactured and trafficked, that really hasn't happened, or at least apparently didn't have a significant impact. But is this a business decision by the Gulf Cartel to say, you know what, everybody's looking out for fentanyl, we're going to get out of this and let the target be put on somebody else? And then the last thing I want to talk about is, if you read my newsletter and if you've been following the news, a few weeks ago, Alberto Nunez Ojeda, who was also known as El Piloto, who was a pilot for Los Chapitos, probably was the person who piloted El Mayo and Joaquin into the United States. He was arrested in Jesus Maria. There was a big military action. There were a lot of thoughts at one point that they were targeting Alfredito. Turns out, apparently, at least according to Annabelle Hernandez, that the action there was actually targeting Ivan. And Ivan apparently escaped through underground tunnels with only a few minutes to spare. That's the story at the moment. And the number of stories in the last few weeks of Ivan being targeted, Ivan being close to being captured, the rise in those stories is startling. So he's clearly on the government's radar. And I always find this interesting too. We've talked about this before. Everything seems to indicate that Ivan is still in the basic Culiacan area. And why he would be there is interesting to me with all of the military presence there. And maybe the information is bad and that's the reason for it. But anyways, wanted to make the note that it was not Alfredito that they were going after when they got El Piloto, but it was instead Ivan. Which leads us into the discussion of the CDS. And if we kind of go back in time, following the capture of El Mayo, there ended up being that fracture between La Maiza and Los Chapitos, the CDS civil war, the power struggle, whatever you want to say. Most people put that, that fracture around September 9th of 2024. According to documents released by the Mexican government last week, since that time, since September 9th, with respect to Los Chapitos, I'm not talking CDS, we're just talking about Los Chapitos, there have been at least 50 high-profile arrests, the seizure of over 600 high-powered weapons, more than 400 vehicles, as well as the seizures of large quantities of fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine. And let's look at some of the losses that Los Chapitos have suffered. So we can start back before this civil war started. Remember, November 2023, El Nini was captured, right? Probably set up by Ivan or Los Chapitos. But remember the comments. Oh my goodness, this is a huge blow for Los Chapitos. And yet that's, a year and a few months ago and nothing, they're still plugging away. But here are some of the major Los Chapitos leaders that have been captured since September 2024. El P, who was the successor to El Nini, chief of security for Ivan, was captured in Culiacan September 19th, 2024. Alcañas, known as the enforcer of northern Sinaloa, was captured in Sinaloa on October 18th, 2024. He, in his arrest, they seized 524 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, and several vehicles. November 14, 2024, El Pelon, the Sonora commander for Los Chapitos, head of Los Pelones, was arrested in Culiacan. Right? And he is said to have been in charge of drug and arms trafficking into the United States, primarily through Arizona. LH was arrested in Culiacan in December 2024. He controlled cartel payrolls and drug transactions. El Tigre was arrested December 17th, 2024 in Pachuca, Hidalgo. El Tigre was a former Quintana Roo police chief turned cartel enforcer. He apparently led extortion and assassination squads in Cancun and that area. La Morsa, known as the Fentanyl King, was captured in January 2025 in Mexico City. He controlled fentanyl production and smuggling routes. He was said to have operated under El Guano, El Chapo's brother. Ricardo N. was captured in Culiacan, and you're seeing a theme of where they're being arrested. January 30, 2025. He was an executioner for Los Chapitos, and it said that he actually had videos of tortures and executions on his phone. El Gato is an expert in drones and explosives. He was arrested February 5 in Mazatlan. Then we have El Jando, again, the cartel pilot we talked about. He was arrested in Jesus Maria, Culiacan. He was said to have been the pilot and a logistics operator for Yvonne. His capture led to a firefight involving government and cartel forces that resulted in at least one soldier's death. And then some others. Humberto Rivera, known as El Chato, El Don, El Viejon, was arrested in Juarez. Then a body was found in San Andreas Acotlan, 10 miles south of Toluca. When they found the body, when the authorities got the body, it was said to have been Mario Alberto Jimenez Castro, also known as El Castor. He was said to have been a close associate of Yvonne, and he was a financial operator for Yvonne and for Los Chapitos. Then more recently, or even more recently, Jose Angel Nabio Inzunana, let me try that one time. Inzunza was arrested in Culiacan, and according to Omar Hamid Garcia Harfush, the Secretary of Security and Citizen Protection of Mexico, Canabio was the head of a security group known as Los Chimales, which provided personal security for Yvonne. And then late last week, Kevin Alonso was also arrested in Culiacan, and he was said to have been in charge of another security faction for Los Chapitos, and more importantly, was said to have been the coordinator for the purchase of weapons and ammunitions for Los Chapitos. So I know that was a quick run through, but doesn't that make you go, oh my God, they've lost a lot, right? A ton. Not to mention, 2 of the 4 Los Chapitos. So when you look at that, what are people saying now? What's going to happen? What's happening today? Well, most experts say that Los Chapitos still have significant operational strength. They still have areas of, that are fortified, that are supporting them, that they still have the supply routes that are critical. So they're far from an imminent demise. At least, if things continue as they have been. The fear amongst many experts is that the violence will continue to escalate, both as Los Chapitos try to keep hold of its territory, and while other cartel leaders, try to gain control. It has been assumed that CJNG will use this to try to expand its influence. I note, and we'll talk about this at the end, but I note that for lack of a better way of saying it, CJNG has been relatively quiet, at least on a national perspective, on a grand scale over the last couple of months, almost looking to let La Maíz and Los Chapitos fight it out and then deal with whoever the survivor is, but not having to deal with, not needing to get involved kind of on a street level. There also is the concern of new players, that if there's a power vacuum, some new group, some smaller group may be able to sneak in and establish more dominance. And then there is discussion that the Gulf Cartel truce was in part in response to members of the Gulf Cartel seeing what was happening to CDS and determining they didn't want that to happen to them. And so, we may be mad at each other, but we'd rather be with each other than being attacked by somebody else. That we're still better as one than we would be as two, or as one fighting from within. As I mentioned, almost everybody says that CJNG should be the biggest beneficiary of any demise of the CDS and the turmoil going on as the two factions fight with each other. One thing that's interesting when you read some of the analysis from some of the experts in this area is the idea that CJNG is going to fight for some of the territory of the Sinaloa Cartel. If they see areas that they can move into, they're going to do that. They've been doing that to some extent, maybe, as I mentioned a moment ago, not as much and as notably as might have been expected. But where their impact, or where the impact of the CDS Civil War could inure to CJNG's benefit, is in other areas in the world. So CDS has more connections in Latin America, more partnerships in Latin America, and in other places in the world, including places like Australia, than CJNG does. And reports suggest that CJNG is actively seeking to either acquire new partnerships or lure partners in Latin America away from CJNG because CJNG or because CDS, is handicapped, is fractured, doesn't have the capabilities it did. So one of the critical things to know is that the cartel war is not just about control over Mexican drug routes. It's an international battle, and seriously and legitimately could reshape the structure of organized crime in the entire Western Hemisphere. And let me give you a specific example. In Colombia, President Gustavo Petro recently said that CDS is to be blamed for violence that has been taking place in the northeast border between Venezuela and Colombia. So the basin on that border, formed by the Catatumbo River, is one of the most important coca leaf producing areas in the world. Colombian authorities have denounced the existence of an alliance between a guerrilla group, the National Liberation Army, also known as ELN, and CDS. The idea is that ELN leaders provide, the base materials, and the cartel provides finances to the guerrillas and also gives them weapons and things. According to the Colombian government, sometime at the beginning of this year, something broke down between that or within that alliance. And as a result, violence has increased in that region, so much so that since the beginning of the year, Colombian authorities suggest that as many as 50,000 people or more have fled their homes in that region because of the violence. So the idea here is that the cartel tentacles, as we've talked about extensively here, are much broader, go much farther than just Mexico itself. And because that's the case, the impact of a CDS fracture, as is going on now, and or a demise of the CDS as we know it at some point in the future, can have long-term ramifications in a lot of areas, that we wouldn't normally think about, including Colombia, including other places in Latin America, including places like Australia, including places like Europe. One other thing that has been noted with respect to this split is that the instability in the organization has had a serious impact on their ability to control actions outside of Mexico. So as the instability within CDS grows, that instability flows past Mexico and into Latin America, into every place that CDS has tentacles, has operations, has some organizational capabilities. So how do we think about this going forward? If we go back, if you think back in time, let's go back to October of 2024. And so this is shortly after the Civil War is broken out. Latin Times has a headline: "The Sinaloa Cartel is dead. Meet the two organizations at war to succeed the once powerful crime syndicate." And I will promise you that between September 2024 and today, I bet you I could find 100 headlines that say almost the same thing. Sinaloa Cartel is dead. We could find that in October of last year, in November of last year, December of last year, January of this year, and we can see them again today. I've got two sitting in front of me, one from just a couple days ago, Los Chapitos on the brink, another one from La Verdad Noticias from a couple weeks ago, the fall of Los Chapitos. So, this is what's coming out. And yet the reality is that right now, CDS still exists. La Maíza obviously still are functional. Los Chapitos are still functional. They're still operating. They're still sending drugs to the United States. So the question is, when are Los Chapitos done? And that's the question I get asked more than anything else these days. what's it going to take? What's the the one pull on the Jenga tower that brings it all down? And to me, it's a simple answer, and maybe it's so simple that I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but it's Yvonne, right? As long as Yvonne is there, I think Los Chapitos will continue to fight, will continue to survive, and will have, a major role in what's going on in Mexico. If he is captured, Alfredito is still there, but I really find it hard to believe, given everything that we know about the power dynamics and the operational dynamics within Los Chapitos, that Alfredito would be in a position to really effectively run Los Chapitos on his own. So if that happens, if Yvonne gets captured, and as we've talked about, there definitely seems to be a target for him, more so than even in the past, right? So if he does get captured, you really wonder, would that be the end of Chapitos? Do you have additional fractionations within Los Chapitos, and how does that play out with respect to the entire cartel? And here's where I ask some other thoughts. And we keep talking about CJ Angie being the one to take over. Let's say Yvonne gets captured, and for all intents and purposes, Los Chapitos has fractionalized beyond belief. Who is going to take over those routes, those people, the product, the fields, everything? Who could do that? Well, you can say it could be CJ Angie, right? Talked about that. Could be somebody that we're not talking about, or it could be Los Mayos. And so then you're going to have a question, I think, within the Mayo camp. All right, who do we hate more? Do we hate the Chapitos and the people who fought for Chapitos, or do we hate CJ Angie? In other words, would Yvonne's capture not only lead to the demise of Los Chapitos, but be the end of CDS, and what would be left of CDS would only be the Mayos? Or would that actually be the triggering point that gets everybody back, ostensibly everyone, we're not talking every single person, but if we get the major factions of CDS getting back together, does that actually put CDS back in a better position with the remnants of Chapitos, La Maiza, and then they could fight CJ Angie and any other intruders? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that yet. You also wonder if let's play this scenario out one more step. So let's say, and by the way, in political science and obviously in other areas, but this whole idea of game theory, I absolutely love it. And so having these discussions isn't necessarily pure hypothesis, right? We can sit down and we can analyze and we can apply scientific methodology to try and see how these scenarios would play out. But let's say Yvonne is captured, and let's say that effectively destroys Los Chapitos. Whether Alfredito tries to lead them for a bit, or they fractionalize, notwithstanding that, or Alfredito is captured as well. Let's say that they're Los Chapitos is effectively done as an organization. And Then let's say that El Mayo's group says, we'd much rather have these folks fighting with us than going to work for CJNG or somebody else. So they get together. Does La Maíza have the operational structure and the organizational structure required to bring in that group in that way? So you could envision it going one of two ways, right? And let's just think of corporate mergers. Big company brings in a competitor. They all get together and they're great. They're wonderful. Excuse me. Or company brings in a competitor and the philosophies, the styles, everything is so different that they never join forces really, and they're almost inevitably doomed to failure because they couldn't coalesce as one entity. Which way would or could it go in that situation under Mayutos? I don't know. And then what about the question of the rumors of an alliance between La Maíza and CJNG? Remember a couple of months ago, there was a lot of talk. In fact, going so far as to say that Ivan was going to be the successor to El Mencho, and various allegations like that or claims. We've heard much less about such an alleged alliance in the last few weeks. We've also heard of some clear indications that CJNG and Los Miles La Maíza were having issues with respect to certain routes through and around Tijuana, and there was the belief that those disputes indicated that any alliance between Maíza and CJNG was more of an alliance for convenience at various times, but not a full-scale organizational-wide alliance. Okay. So we'll see how that plays out. What's the point of all of this? I mean, other than, again, the machinations of this and how this is all going to go is fascinating. We've talked about it over and over from a purely academic standpoint, how these cartels are organized, how they are run, how they're structured, how there's a succession plan, if at all, is fascinating to watch. And we're going to want to keep doing that, not just from an academic standpoint, but the more you understand those elements of the cartels, the better your strategy against them can be. So there's value in understanding this. But the two things that really stand out to me of why this is important, why we want to know about this, is you're going to see more of these headlines, right? Everybody wants to write a definitive headline. The fall of Los Chapitos, the fall of CDS, whatever it may be. And I want to encourage people to read beyond the headlines, and more importantly, to think beyond the headlines. The second is, if we're thinking about how the Mexican government has been handling this, President Sheinbaum hasn't been in office that long, but it seems to me that one could draw the inference from much of what's happened that President Sheinbaum is not the huge supporter of hugs, not bullets, that people thought she would be, and B, that the government's focus on Los Chapitos is clear and that their effectiveness in going after Chapitos has been significant and something that definitely separates her, at least at this point in time, from her successors. If you remember back, I was one of the lone voices suggesting that President Sheinbaum, once the election was over, would be far more willing to deviate, at least to some extent, from AMLO's policies. And I think that's being borne out, and that is resulting in some of these changes that we've talked about. All right. Hopefully that was kind of interesting. As I say, there's just so much going on every day. Somebody new is being arrested, or somebody new is close to being arrested. So we'll continue to try to follow this. And we're going to talk more again, as I mentioned earlier, about the Gulf Cartel. Next week, we'll have more on what's going on. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my new website and my new book, and I'll let you know what it's about and how you can get it if you want, and why it may be of interest. So with that, thanks again for joining me. That's Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena for this week, and I will talk to you next week. Thanks, everyone.